Good day, everyone. I hope you guys have an amazing day. So, what I'll do today, I will briefly talk about permit management side of things. And one more thing, I just wanted to mention that this course, what today's episode will be the last I'll be doing on the PSS side, because let's be honest, right? I mean, not many companies use PSS, and it's the glorified version of Salesforce app, to be honest, right? They build few custom objects and they call it as like their own standard object and selling it very expensive price model and yeah, which you could also customize it in house, right? So I don't see much value in teaching this course, this specific PSS, because I mean, most of you wouldn't have used PSS so far unless you're really working for a government agency. Uh, Otherwise, most of the places you don't really use PSS at this stage. Yes, there are cool stuff. I've spoken about a few of the stuff, right? Like ARC, I talked about, action plan template, I talked about. Those things are admin side of things, which I believe adds a good value in terms of user experience. But when it comes to, for instance, the business application or license application, you just need to know what is out there, right? So that's the key thing you should be paying attention. So I briefly touched about that. Today I'm going to talk about very briefly about the permit management. Why do we need it, and where do you use it, right? And I'll just going to show you a little bit of a data model. So what I'm planning to do from the next episode, I'm going to start important, which useful stuff, I would say, course on flows, right? Because obviously everyone uses flows, and it's more important, it's more fun to do hands-on, rather than I'm talking about license management. You must be wondering, look, mate, I don't use license management, so or for that matter, permit management, so it's pretty much irrelevant, right? So it's a waste of time. So um, I won't say waste of time. That's a bit harsh if I say that, but you know what I'm trying to get, right? So it's easy. It's PSS is really easy. So I've covered the admin part, which you should know, and then the core aspect is the Omni Studio, right? And that's I have a plan to do a separate course on Omni Studio. So and then use of other Salesforce functionality. If you are very familiar with it, then you're pretty much good to use the PSS, right? It's not difficult. Okay, that being said, so let's talk about the permit management, or what's this called? Why do we need, sorry, not permit management. Uh, I was planning to do inspection management. My apologies. This words got mixed up. Right. Just so when we talk about the inspection management, right? Now, why do we need an inspection? Now, you must be thinking, right? So if you have followed along, you would remember I briefly touched upon business license application, individual application. So obviously, what happens, right? If you are applying for a license, or if you're applying for a permit, before a permit is issued, in some constituents or some counties or some states, what they normally do, they often send someone to inspect your location before they hand off the permit or license, right? This is just to ensure that your business is in compliance with what is supposed to be compliant. For instance, if they wanted to give you a permit to run a hair salon or restaurant, they wanted to make sure you have every safety precaution in place. You have all the necessary compliance you have taken care of, and your building is earthquake proof. You shouldn't be renting a place which is highly prone to earthquake and in the verge of collapse, right? So I'm just giving a very simple scenario, right? Because, like for instance, in New Zealand, if you're from New Zealand, you might know, right? That's some of the buildings which are highly prone to earthquake. They often won't let you use it, right? Like for instance, there is a church and near my place, right? It's a pretty good-looking church, but you can't really use it because it's considered as to be unusable because of the highly risk of collapse, right? So So if you are renting an apartment, so obviously first of all you shouldn't be renting, and person shouldn't be renting you that. But just let's take an example, right? Some shady place. If you rented a place and that building is almost an expiry date is almost about to collapse, you obviously won't get a permit, right? So that's why usually in, like I said, some place people do send, like in New Zealand we have a high trust model because the main reason is we are a very small country, 5.2 million population, unlike countries where population is huge. There's a kind of a trust model we still have in place. So often people trust, and but that being said, they do send people to inspect the place. So when happen, right? So obviously the inspection guy normally have to measure your property, or whatever they're measuring based on the certain authorization codes. And that authorization codes, they have to check whether, if, for instance, this building meets the certain safety standard, that you have a fire exit, your building is not built using that hibiscus or whatever that old flammable material, and plus it's and there's no the safety risk to the person who will be working there, that kind of stuff, right? So if they think you're in a violation of it, so obviously they can report it and send it back. Now, why do we need to use the PSS, right? You must be wondering. So what's the big deal? They can take a piece of a paper, write it down. So yeah, they can do that in an old school way, right? They can do a piece of paper, write it down, or they can carry a paper with a checklist. But imagine, in 2024, right? You're carrying a piece of a paper, which is pretty much ridiculous, right? I'm not saying you can't do that. You obviously can do that. There's nothing stopping you from doing that, but that's not really an effective way to go to a place to do an inspection. You obviously need to do sometimes online checking of certain codes. If you're not sure about it, you might want to get a second opinion. So PSS give you that option, right? You can define a lot of pre codes, you can define checklist, and you can submit the violation, and it hits the record database, right? So you can use the Salesforce app to do that. So that's gives you more flexibility when it comes. And obviously, if your business is already using Salesforce, then it makes total sense, right? You have an app which syncs it back to the actual version. Um, when I say version, means actual instance of the Salesforce. Uh, yeah, it's a different story. If your organization is not using Salesforce, then there's no point of using PS, right? So this is under the assumption that your government agency is leveraging Salesforce. If they're using Microsoft, CRM Dynamics, or if they're using HubSpot, if they're using something else, then that's a different. Then you don't really need to worry about the pieces. You can use their own proprietary functionality associated with their software. So now let's assume that you wanted to start learning how to about the permit management, right? Or inspection management. How do you do that? So obviously, like I said, I'm using a trial org. So a lot of things are pre-configured. And but that being said, when you get to this inspection um, management, right? You will have this drop down, and there is something called learning home, and you can follow this. You have um, admin stuff here. It will actually gives you a few things you need to do, which is pretty useful. So I would highly encourage you to go through this guided setup if you're doing this for the first time, because there are a lot of pre-configured stuff. I've already spoken about these things, right? When we were when I initially started the public sector module. So you got to get started. Under get started, you have verify the license, configure the domain, uh, org-wide email, the basic stuff, install Omni Studio. So obviously, if you've signed up for a trial org, you don't really need to do any of it because everything is pre-configured. But if you're individually installing an app, then you might have to do something like this, right? Configure user, you can configure, which is pretty basic Salesforce knowledge. Permission sets, pretty basic Salesforce knowledge. Configure organization setting, pretty basic Salesforce knowledge, right? You need to enable the person account and all this stuff. All those good stuff you can do. Then you can also look for approval setup. Obviously, if you know how to set up an approval, because it's a part of a business process, you need to have an approval in place. Then you have intake officer. Then you normally talk about the application approval, right? Because even so, usually what happens in permit management, or your the person uh, who is going to visit your premises, your location or your business, will need to have a visit record created, and that visit record is often associated with your application. So if you're a business application, so if you look at the, let's say if I have a business license application, right? And in the business license application, if you go to the related options, there is something called a visit, right? So let's say this guy has a planned visit. So what that means is that, okay, I'm the case officer. I got this application, but I'm not convinced that this person, is eligible for this. But even though, I feel he may not be eligible, but I would prefer somebody to go and inspect the property. So before we make a final decision, so you create a visit in record, and let's say I want somebody to go and visit the business today. So you create it and you assign to the right person, and then what happened is that that visit gets scheduled, and that visit record get assigned to all the checklists and kind of stuffs, right? So that is, um, when once you do that, you can do, you can also uh, create an action plan, and you can create an action template. I already spoken about action template, action plan, right? And how do you assign that to your application? So that makes the job of a person who's inspecting easier, because then you have a predefined checklist. The person goes through the checklist. Right. There is a standard checklist, or you can have a dynamic assessment, right? If you are looking for a simple assessment, then having a simple assessment in the sense, right? The few things you want to check. But in the dynamic assessment, what happens is that, what happens if the business is tiny? What happened if the business is big? What happened this and that kind of stuff, right? All those conditional logic you can use in the dynamic assessment. And then you have inspector management, and you talk about assessment task, action plan, visit an application. You have to assign the um, uh, action plan to your visit, so that this will get tied up together very properly. So this is in general, right? If you talk about the permit management, I understand you must be thinking, right, this is not really much useful. Yeah, it is not much useful, to be honest. I mean, this is all of you, it's pretty simple to use it, right? All you have to do is that you create an application, which I already showed you how to do that in a business application. Create a visit record, hook up to it, it will get scheduled, and you send some person, and yeah. And now coming to the important thing, that we got um, the inspection data model. So as you can see, there are a lot of objects involved. These are all the PSS, which is called the Salesforce standard, but it's behind the scenes a custom object. So you have inspection visit, and which is linked to all of this kind of things, right? So I would highly encourage you to go through it, and go through it if you're really interested to, right? Because I honestly don't use any of this stuff, right, in my day-to-day Salesforce stuff, which I associate with, because we don't do anything to do with the permit or license, right? If you're involved in it, then it's a better opportunity for you to. But everything is available, and so yeah, you can get associated with it. So if you wanted to learn, that's why I was trying to say that, right? I don't see that this course, right, I'm doing PSS, is going to add much value if I keep on adding this, like uh, talking about tiny elements which without much context. So that's the reason why I wanted to stop the PSS course. I've done the admin part, which is that's all you need to know. And the Omni Studio, that which I will do, that is important for you to know, irrespective of PSS or not. And the Flow course, which I'm going to start next, right, which will be very useful. Because obviously Flow is pretty simple to use, but I'm going to teach you guys some of the cool stuff with the flows, right? And yeah, so that being said, that's all I wanted to cover in this episode. Hope you guys have an amazing Saturday. Adios.